Okay, guys, so this is your video for week 2. Like I said in the email, I'm sorry that I can't come in and do the class in person, but I'm still waiting on my PCR test result, and yeah, as you can probably hear, I'm a little bit ill. So I thought it was better just to record this and send it to you, and then just watching this. So just watch this video, and it's in the form of a lecture about Birth of a Nation, and then this will be the class for this week, okay? And then hopefully on next Monday, um, everything will be fine, and I'll be able to give the next class in person. Okay, so let's get on with it. So we'll start with a quote from Danny, who we saw last week. If you weren't in the class last week, then you can look at the PowerPoint, which I put on eCampus. Sorry, I need some water. And this is a quote that just says, "The American autobiography is written as the autobiography of the settler. The native has no place in it." And we'll talk about that quote as we go through the class. The main thing that you should just think now is that we can think of Birth of a Nation as a kind of autobiography, but obviously it's an autobiography written by a specific group and with very, very specific aims in mind when it comes to how it represents the people that it features in the autobiography, and also who it ignores too. But we'll talk about that as we go through. Okay, so Birth of a Nation, directed by D.W. Griffith. It's a notoriously, and as I'm sure you've seen, profoundly racist depiction of the years following the American Civil War, which is known as the Reconstruction period. And the Reconstruction period in America is this kind of period from about the middle of the 1860s and the end of the Civil War up until around the end of the 19th century, so around the 1900s or so. And it's the period in which American society, as we now know it throughout the majority of the 20th century, came into being by recovering from the damage and the kind of destruction that had been caused by the Civil War. That's what we mean by Reconstruction, or the Reconstruction period in America. And Birth of a Nation was the first 12-reel film ever made, so it was made on 12 separate reels of film. Longest film ever to be released in cinemas up until that point, up until 1915, and it was also the first film ever to be shown in the White House. So Woodrow Wilson, the president of America at the time, had a private screening with Griffiths in which he showed him the film, and in which Wilson said that he admired the film and he liked the film very much. So if you want to have a sense of the kind of culture that American presidents were used to witnessing at the start of the 19th century, start of the 20th century, sorry, in 1915, then Birth of a Nation takes you quite a long way towards understanding that, if you know that it was shown in the White House and it was approved of. So one of, if not the biggest or most influential things in terms of technical filmmaking. We're not going to talk a lot about technical filmmaking because there's a lot written about how influential Birth of a Nation is as a piece of cinema, but in this course we're more interested in what it tells us about a kind of colonial mentality and a kind of colonial mindset. So we're not going to spend too long looking at why it is that Griffiths' filmmaking itself was influential as opposed to the content of what he put in his movie and the way that he portrayed specific groups within that film. But what we can say is that he pioneered something called continuity editing, which is essentially the method of filmmaking. We see it all the time now. It's just where a sense of overarching narrative and action is created by editing large reels of film together in order to create the sense that different scenes are taking place at the same time and that they're building towards a kind of climax. And we can see this in the climactic scenes of Birth of a Nation, in which the clan kind of ride in to save the day. And before that, we see groups of people in different positions doing different things. We see the people hiding out. We see the people outside trying to get in. And we see the clan riding on their horses. And what continuity editing does is it splices all of those images and those small shots together in order to create the sense, the cinematic sense, that they're all happening at the same time. So it's a method of filmmaking which enables basically a kind of blockbuster cinema, a kind of exciting and a kind of fast-paced sense of tension. If you can create the sense that different things are happening at once in different parts of the story and they're all converging together, that's what continuity editing allows you to do. Yeah, and this had a major effect on the way in which filmmaking developed afterwards. The film itself was also an example of, or had a very aggressive marketing campaign, and it was one of, if not the first film to try and be marketed to middle and upper class audiences, in the sense that prior to the film being released, prior to Birth of a Nation, the cinema was somewhere which would only show small films. They would often be quite disrespectful places to go. They might be dirty. They might be associated with working class life. They might also be kind of associated with brothels and with sex work and with they would have a variety of cultural associations, which would mean that middle to upper class people would very much disapprove of going there. So they would rather go to the theatre than the opera, for example, than go to the cinema, go to see motion pictures. However, with Birth of a Nation, there was a concerted effort, a deliberate and powerful effort to attract a different kind of audience to the cinema, an audience that wouldn't usually go. And it was successful, largely speaking. Birth of a Nation made more money than any film released up until that point. And once its reputation as a kind of what was then at the time thought of as being quite an exciting, fast-paced film took off, then lots and lots of people went to see it, and lots of people went to see it who would not previously have gone to the cinema before. So again, if we think about the idea that this film was shown in the White House, we can also think about the extent to which middle and upper class white people would have gone to see this film and would have enjoyed it and would have been excited about it. Which tells us again something about the general attitude towards race and what the film depicts as America is in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, as this is what the film's depiction of race, the film's depiction of violence is by no means exceptional. As obvious as it is to us today that this would be unacceptable and wrong, it does represent a kind of general consensus amongst large parts of the American population in terms of what that period in history was like. And we talked last week a bit about how post-colonial cinema does not just mean cinema from old colonies, but it means cinema which allows us to interrogate and to understand things about colonialism that we might not have seen otherwise or might not have understood otherwise. And I think one of the reasons why Birth of a Nation is interesting is because it allows us to understand the way in which a large part of the American population genuinely thought about the history of the Civil War, what it meant to be a white person in America, what it meant to be a black person in America. And also within that, the role of the Ku Klux Klan, who in reality were essentially a group of, or were essentially a kind of militia from in the southern states who would terrorize freed slaves into behaving in a certain way and would also conduct lynchings and intimidated the black populations of the South at several points into not voting in elections during the Reconstruction period. Within the narrative of Birth of a Nation, however, what we see is that the Ku Klux Klan are kind of these noble, brave figures who save the day at the end and who also kind of stand between the degenerate freed slaves and the corrupt and useless kind of petty bureaucrats and petty lawyers who don't understand the need for action. So they are very much the heroes of the film, which is historically extremely repellent, but at the same time, when we look at a film like this, we see its success, we see the amount of people who believed it, then we also see something about the way in which America, at least large sections of America, viewed itself at the time in which the film was made and the time in which it was distributed. Okay, so we'll just go on to a little bit about Reconstruction. So Griffiths, quotes from him, he believed that cinema in general had the capacity to present objective history. So he thought that if you watched a film about a historical period and it was well made, it would be as if you were watching the events themselves. So he had this kind of professed faith in objectivity. He said that cinema had the potential to present a vivid and complete expression of historical events, as if the person watching it was present at the making of history. So we can see that the vivid and complete expression of historical events, as if the person watching it was present at the making of history. And there's an obvious irony here in that Birth of a Nation is an extraordinarily biased film, to the extent that it's now more famous for its racism than it is for anything else about it, justifiably so. However, Griffiths insisted that he was not making propaganda. He insisted that this was just the way that things were for him. And many people agreed with him too. If we think of this, so that's Griffiths, what we see in Birth of a Nation is Griffiths' view of Reconstruction, which is essentially that freed slaves were not properly able, did not have the sufficient character or the moral structure to be able to integrate into American society, that they were dangerous, that they were degenerate, that politicians were likely to also be weak, and that it took the brave intervention of organizations like the Ku Klux Klan to set things right and to rescue America from a kind of chaos which it was risking descending into, both during the Civil War and after it. And we see this in the final scene, or the kind of climactic scene, in which the KKK ride in to save the day, and they're presented as very strong and powerful, and the individuals that they are fighting are presented as chaotic and degenerate, and as a force of chaos which is threatening and is going to tear the country apart. Obviously, studies of Reconstruction that are serious histories instead of racist propaganda pieces, as the content of Birth of a Nation is, take more nuanced approaches and write about the way in which, in reality, Reconstruction was a period in which real gains were made for newly freed slaves in America. The great African-American historian W.E.B. Du Bois, whose book Black Reconstruction was hugely influential, but was written a couple of decades after Birth of a Nation was even released, and was the first major book to try to intervene in and to set right the huge prejudice which at that point existed historically in terms of describing the Reconstruction period, especially in terms of the role that that Black people had played in it. Argued that Du Bois kind of shows that due to organization, due to their intervention in the Civil War, due to attempts at kind of new kinds of political organization following the Civil War, the Reconstruction period was a point at which you did see actual, real, meaningful gains for this new group of citizens, freed slaves in the South of the USA, especially. And Du Bois says that these people, they had a moment in the sun, which means that they had a moment in which it looked like things were going to get better, and it looked as if they might be able to improve both their lives, but also improve the general life in America per se in general. But then Du Bois describes how, as a result of both the interests of kind of capital and big money, and also as a result of the racist attitude of politicians, and finally with the help of the Ku Klux Klan, who, as I say, were much more of a kind of thug-like militia force than they were a band of heroes, ensured that Black people became much more disenfranchised very quickly, and the state of affairs that we know of, especially in the southern states up until the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, came into being. So Reconstruction is both a period of hope and of genuine potential for change, and it's also a period in which that hope fails, in which it's destroyed, and it's destroyed by the intervention of the KKK alongside the organization of big money in the South, which saw its interest in the disenfranchisement of Black people rather than in their equality. And yeah, just a few points. So C.L.R. James, the historian who we'll be looking at next week, when we talk a little bit about Haiti, he famously said, and I think this quote is funny, he famously said that he would picket Birth of a Nation whenever it came out, which meant that he would protest against it, but at the same time he also thought the film was a great work of art, was what he said. He thought cinematically it was brilliant, and its content was obviously racist, so he said that he would sneak in to watch it in the cinema in the morning, and then he would picket it in the afternoon. And it's also, as I say, it's important to think about the way in which the kind of attitudes that Birth of a Nation shows, the views towards African Americans, that it shows this consistent presentation that they are backward, that they are sexually aggressive, that they are not suited yet to be integrated into American society. This is not unique to the film, and actually lots of people, lots of historians have pointed out the way in which this kind of racist presentation of non-white people in the US and former slaves especially continues up until the present, and the way in which you can see it still in public institutions in the US. And the biggest institution, or the biggest kind of social phenomena in which you can see this in America, is mass incarceration. So the American prison system. And several historians write about the way in which this assumed idea that African Americans possess a kind of defective character, this racist notion, plays a large role in mass incarceration. And Michelle Alexander, who wrote a book called The New Jim Crow, which, if anyone is interested in the system of mass incarceration in the US and how it works, I would recommend that you read that. She's pointed out several times that there are now more African Americans in prison than there were slaves prior to the Civil War. So it's by no means the case that the attitudes that Birth of a Nation expresses have gone from American society. And it's by no means the case that the social results of those attitudes have gone either. We see it in mass incarceration, and we see it in police violence in relation to black people, especially in the US. And yeah, just one more point is that, as I said, the Klan did play a big role in disenfranchising freed slaves in the southern states, and the shots in Birth of a Nation towards the end, where we see the Klan intimidating voters out of voting. That happened. That's true. Obviously, it wasn't something heroic. It was profoundly unjust and violent. However, that is true. The Klan were used as essentially enforcers and violent enforcers who were able to ensure that, or helped to ensure that black people and freed slaves remained disenfranchised, did not get political representation, and they intimidated them into not voting, essentially, in elections. Okay, so I've said a little bit about the history of Birth of a Nation, about why it's influential as a kind of technical filmmaking exercise, and what its view of history means and how we might contest that. From a post-colonial perspective, there are a few things that we can say about it, which we can also bear in mind and build from. So I put this film near the start of the course, or as the first film on the course proper, not just because it's early, because it's made in 1915, but also because I think, as with last week, we can use it to introduce a few concepts or a few ideas which are going to be useful when we think about other kinds of post-colonial cinema, or other cinema that we look at through a kind of post-colonial lens or a post-colonial perspective. And as I said at the end last week, post-colonial cinema is not cinema that is made in a post-colonial situation, i.e. in a former colony, although it may be that, but it's cinema that allows us to understand the structures and the aspects of colonization, and allows us to critique colonization and to understand how it works and how it affects us and how we can see it in our own lives. So with that in mind, one of the things that Birth of a Nation does is provide a perspective on the ideology of nations and of the formation of a nation, which presents, I mean, what the film does is kind of show this process in which, especially towards the end, the nation, the country, becomes unified as a result of the heroic actions of a group who rescue it from kind of forces of chaos and from corruption and from a civil war, the results of which have threatened to overwhelm it. So the film wants its audience to think that the KKK, essentially the kind of racist militia, are the heroes who have saved the nation, who have founded a new nation, or a reborn America. And we're going to come back to this idea definitely at the end of the course, but we can touch on it a few times throughout the course. But something we can say about this is that it forms a kind of founding mythology or a founding myth for the new America. And what we mean by this is that it provides a kind of justification for not only for history, but also for the way in which America existed in 1915, which was still a profoundly racist system of organization. Segregation still existed in the South. Lynching was still very much a fairly common practice. I think in 1922, so 7 years after the film was released, something like 200 lynch killings took place, and they were very rarely, if ever, there was very rarely, if ever, any criminal prosecution or any action carried out against the groups of people who took part in lynch attacks. So we have this idea that Birth of a Nation is a founding mythology. It shows an image of how Griffiths thought America came to be, and in that image it also justifies the current state of things in America. And when we're hearing about this, we should be thinking about what we talked about last week in Fanon, about the way in which the settler fabricates the native, the way in which the ruling group creates the image of the group that they are subjugating or they are ruling in order to justify their rule and in order to legitimate their rule. And I'm just going to mention Walter Benjamin here, who is a philosopher who has one essay which is, in my view, not as important for post-colonial studies as it should be so far, but is certainly useful in this context. And this is him here. That's Benjamin, taken around the time that he wrote The Critique of Violence. And what he does in The Critique of Violence is he presents a description of political violence. He says violence is often political. And when it's used politically, it's either law-making or law-enforcing. And this kind of violence makes examples of people, and it establishes what we can think of as kind of being borders. And what I mean by borders is that when violence creates or enforces a law, it punishes a kind of transgression. And what we mean by transgression is the crossing of a moral line, which, as soon as a person has crossed that line, they are then subject to violence, or they can be subject to violence. So we're not just talking about the borders of a country or the boundaries of a country, even though we can think about borders in that way. And nation formation is a process of the formation of borders, which does involve this kind of lawmaking and law enforcing violence, as we'll look at later in the course as well. But legal violence also enforces borders within a country, so it enforces kinds of behaviors which are acceptable for different groups. And it punishes people who overstep those borders. And what we see in Birth of a Nation, in the kind of central, what's arguably the central scene of the film, in which a freed slave attempts to assault a white girl who then falls to her death as a result, is a kind of ideological representation of this kind of transgression of a, we see an image, a false ideological racist image of a freed slave who is justifiably punished for his actions, at least within the language of the film or within the logic of the film. In reality, lynching was a fairly common practice with almost no justification most of the time, often with a assumption of sexual intent or sexual aggression which had almost no basis. So what we see in Birth of a Nation is the image of this as it kind of exists in the mind of the subjugator, or we could say to an extent of the colonizer, even though obviously within America that relation is not as direct between former slaves and white property owners. However, we see the way in which the logic of this kind of justice works in order to support the power and the domination of one group over another. And obviously, in reality, the number of people who were lynched, or the vast majority of people who suffered this kind of violence, were not rapists, did not do very much to cause this violence, whether they were victims of a kind of racist assumption. And we can think about this kind of violence as being important for colonialism because it shows us the way in which groups who carry it out kind of reinforce themselves and reinforce their own power. And it shows us how the kind of laws that exist within a colonial situation exist in order to both mark out certain people, in this case freed slaves, as punishable and as in some way deserving the violence which is enacted against them, and also other people as justified in their actions. And for Benjamin, this is at the root of most laws, most of the laws which restrain action and which govern the way that people live within a kind of property-based society, contain the residue of something like a foundational act of violence, which was necessary for them to come into being. So there's the critique of violence. The essay is, it's difficult, but we can I'll give you a sense of what this quote means or why I thought it was important. So Benjamin basically says that any law begins as a kind of act of violence or has a kind of founding violence at its start. And he says that a law like this is not an end that would be free of and independent from violence, but on the contrary, an end that under the name of power is necessarily and intimately bound up with it being violence. So the positing of law is the positing of power, and in this respect, an act of an immediate manifestation of violence. Justice is the principle of all divine end positing. Power is the principle of all mythic law positing. That final sentence is a bit wacky and confusing, but I can explain it for you. So essentially what he's saying is that laws which people live under have a kind of residue of violence. They required a kind of violence to bring them about. And we can think about this in relation to the southern states of America. So if we think about things like segregation, and we think about things like the disenfranchisement of black people, and the prevalence of lynching in the southern states as well throughout the end of the 19th and the early 20th century, up until the 60s even, and arguably in the form of police violence up until now. What we see is the relationship between very extreme acts of violence and legal restrictions and legal codes. And Benjamin always thought that laws and legal control of people could never really get rid of the kind of foundational act of violence that gave birth to it. And we, again, if we go back to lynching, we see the way in which minor transgressions, such as looking a white person in the eye or talking to a white woman, things like this could often mark someone who was not white as if they were a sexual predator, as if they were aggressive, and this would make them vulnerable to this kind of extreme kind of violence. And what this violence did is not just punish people who were assumed to have transgressed, but it also reinforced the kind of power relations which existed between the groups, between the group which is carrying out the violence and the individual, and the group that individual represents or is a part of, who is suffering it. So, I'm sorry, I know this is quite a complicated bit, but essentially all I'm saying is that Birth of a Nation shows in quite vivid detail, actually, something like the process through which a country like America could be formed. But it does this in an ideological way, so it doesn't show us the truth of the KKK. It doesn't show us lynch justice. Rather, it shows us that from how it appears to the eyes of the dominant group, to the eyes of the group who is subjugating the other group. So again, we can learn and we can study this kind of film to see how national ideology, to see how ideas of nationhood work, and how the kind of violence which underpins this kind of legal restriction which you got in the southern states of America, how that works, how it comes about, and maybe how it continues to affect life too. So the second thing that I want to draw attention to, and at this point we can watch a clip of the film, is this presentation of the pastoral, which you see in the scenes early on in the film, in which you kind of see people working on the plantation. And Saidiya Hartman, that's her, who is a very intelligent and articulate African-American historian and theorist writing at the moment, she writes about the pastoral. So the pastoral is a genre of film and literature which is concerned with the rhythms and the life of the countryside as opposed to the city, and which tends to present agriculture and working in fields and the countryside in general as being more innocent and pure than a corrupt city life. Hartman writes about the way in which this genre is often used in representations of slavery to quote-unquote naturalize slavery, to cover over the violence of slavery, and to make it seem as if slavery was something that was good for all parties. Slavery was kind of, all you had to do was work in a field, and you knew your owner might be quite nice, and you didn't really want anything more than being able to go out and work and come home and sing your songs. That was how some people have represented the slave system in America, and Hartman understands very articulately that that kind of genre of representation serves to cover over what obviously relations of violence and exploitation. Slavery was not a pleasant system. Slavery was not good for the slaves who were involved in it. and neither was it good for the people who owned the slaves, really, but that's a different kind of question. So we're just going to watch some clips from Birth of a Nation, in which about 12 minutes in which we see a kind of pastoral presentation of the plantation system. I'll guide you through it a little bit. So we start with the music is very soft. We see the cotton field. We see people working in it quite calmly. They're picking cotton. There's no sense of coercion here. There's no sense that people are being forced to work. Also, the field itself there's lots of space in it. There's no sense of the actual kind of discipline which was required in order to make people work on plantations as slaves. And we also see the slave owner walking through the field as if he is perfectly at home with the slaves that he owns, as if they respect him and he respects them. Again, this is a deeply ideological presentation of what the reality of slavery was, but it tells us something about the mindset of the slave owner, and also of the mindset of Griffiths as he looks back over this period in American history, which is about 65 years prior to the date that Birth of a Nation was made. And we can just see in the background other slaves working, but nobody appears to be unhappy. Nobody appears to be being forced to work. In the foreground, we have slave-owning characters or propertied characters, people with money, white people with money, who are engaging in their own kind of conversation. So we get a very clear sense that there are two different worlds here. There is the world of the slaves, and there is the world of the slave owners, but we don't really get any sense that there is any kind of tension between these two groups. Rather, we get the sense that each one of them is relatively happy with the other. He says bye to the slaves, they doff his cap at him, they take their hat off. It's this kind of friendly relation. This guy's being very polite. He shows his owner, tells his owner to sit down. They seem to have a friendly relationship. And everyone's having a nice time. So you get the idea. The basic idea is that we have this, again, extremely ideological presentation in which slavery is presented as if it's natural, as if it's good for all parties, and as if it contains no coercion or violence. And as I know, I say that word a lot, but there's very little else that you can use other than that word. And this is a long quote from Hartman, but I'll talk you through it. So essentially, she says, look, in the social landscape of the pastoral, slavery is depicted as an organic relationship. So an organic relationship is like a natural relationship. It's a relationship of nature. It's not a relationship which is forced in any way, but it's a relationship which exists of its own account and is beneficial for all of the people who are involved in it. So totalizing that neither master nor slave could express the simplest human feelings without reference to the other. Thus the master and the slave are seen as, if not peacefully coexisting, at the very least enjoying a relationship, of paternalistic dependency and reciprocity. So the slave owner acts as a kind of father, acts as someone who takes care of his slaves and who is kind to them. And the slave responds in kind by being polite and kind to the slave owner and by working hard for him because he likes him. And all of this is completely ideological, obviously, but we see this in Birth of a Nation in the clips that we've just seen. We see the paternalistic, the fatherly attitude of the slave owner, and we see the gentleness of the slave as if there is no coercion involved. And we say, Hartman continues, in this instance, paternalism minimizes the extremity of domination with assertions about the mutually recognized humanity of master and slave. Even the regime of production becomes naturalized as the rhythms of work, as if slave labor were merely another extension of blacks' capacity for song and dance. The law of the pastoral is in reconciling sentiment with the brute force of the racial economic order. So, this paternalism, this idea that the slave owner cares for his slaves and wants the best for them, minimizes the extremity of domination. So it minimizes the extent to which slaves are completely dominated by the system that literally owns them and which would force them to work with extreme levels of coercion. And again, we just saw in the clip that we just watched the way in which rhythms of work, so this idea that you get up in the morning, you do your work, you have a break, you have a song and a dance, and then you go back to work, all of this becomes naturalized. All of this appears as something that is just how it should be, and it's not criticized and it's not interrogated within the film or within any kind of pastoral presentation of slavery. Thus, the brutality and antagonisms of slavery are obscured in favor of an enchanting reciprocity. The pastoral renders the state of domination as an ideal of care, duty, familial obligation, gratitude, and humanity. This is a false representation of slavery, evidently, but one of the reasons why Birth of a Nation, sorry, that should say Hartman, not Hartman. I'll correct it in the final PowerPoint that I upload too. This is one of the reasons why representations of slavery, which I'll correct it now, why the pastoral is useful for these representations, because it allows those who benefited from slavery to look back on it as if it was peaceful and as if it was good, as opposed to what it actually was, which was neither peaceful nor good. again, Birth of a Nation is interesting from a post-colonial perspective because, as I keep saying, it allows us to understand how these kind of ideologies play themselves out in the mind of the dominating culture or the mind of the colonial culture. And the final point, really, I want to make about the film, which is something we'll touch on towards the end of the course in relation to the US, but we might talk about throughout the course, is who isn't in it. And remember, this is a film called Birth of a Nation. So it's a film about, at least in the mind of Griffiths, it's a film about how America as we know it came to be. And something which is not featured at all in the film is the Native American individual, who, as the name suggests, is the original kind of colonized subject, is the person in America who is most disenfranchised, who still does not have any actual meaningful citizenship or political inclusion within the US, has no congressional representation, for example, under law. And we don't have to say a huge amount about this because it's not really what the film is about. But if we're thinking about the way in which the film presents a kind of ideology, especially a kind of, in some way, autobiography of the dominant group, of the ruling group, and how it saw itself at the time, the complete absence of a American Indian or of a Native American individual or group in the film speaks to or tells us about the extent to which those people have been erased from the history of the US by this point, almost. And they don't even feature in the mind of Griffiths when he is writing what he considered to be his great autobiography, but also his depiction of what he thought were objective historical events. And we'll come back to this later in the course, but we have what appears to be very obviously is a subjugated dichotomy in the film, and we see the way in which the settler constructs the idea of the black subject in the film and uses film to justify the continued domination of that subject and the violence which affects the life of that subject. But what we don't see is the way in which Native Americans, the conditions in which they live, which we will talk a bit more about towards the end of the course. But something that this tells us is, at least within the ideology of a certain kind of colonial mindset, they have been more or less wiped out to the extent that they don't even feature historically in this narrative at all. And the final point that I want to dwell on, which is useful for thinking about post-colonial cinema, is the extent to which Birth of a Nation has influenced a lot of films that you see and that we still see today. Sorry, ignore that. I'm getting an email. So we've talked about continuity editing as being something which exercised an immense influence. But once we see Birth of a Nation, we start, and I'm sure you guys can think of numerous examples in films that you've seen probably fairly recently, in which the kind of imagery of Birth of a Nation is recalled, or in which you see echoes of it in a way which, while it may be changed and while it may be different, is nonetheless recognizable, both in terms of the way that the editing works, but also in terms of the way that different groups are coded and presented. And I'm going to end by showing you this clip from Lord of the Rings, which we can watch alongside the end, I think, of Birth of a Nation. So let's just watch this clip and then I'll end the lecture.
Sound in the deep one last time.
Okay, so hopefully you get the point. But again, something that I want to foreground about what we mean when we're doing post-colonial cinema, or we're looking at cinema through the post-colonial. Oops, sorry. I mean, we could also include the Avengers in this, by the way, but we don't have to. When we're looking at cinema through a kind of post-colonial lens, is not only looking at cinema which is obviously from either the colonial period or which was made in a former colony, but seeing the way in which the residues and the echoes and the influences of the kinds of thinking that we associate with the colonialism continue to present themselves in our lives and in the cultural products that we consume. Okay, guys, that's it. So thank you for being patient with me this week. I hope that you enjoyed this lecture. The course will not work in this way, hopefully, very often. Hopefully, it won't work in this way again. I have my PCR test results today, I hope, and then I hope that I will be back with you next Monday in person. If you don't hear from me, then you should assume that the class will be in person next week. And the film for next week is Burn, and it is on eCampus, so please watch it there. By the end of this week, I will also have uploaded a full list of the films that we're going to watch. Okay, so take care. See you on Monday. And yeah, you can write to me if you have any questions. Okay, bye.